What is up, dads? Welcome to Act-A-Dad, the awesome dad show. I am thrilled to bring you a very esteemed guest today. He's the author of 8 books and co-authoring his latest book, The Boy Crisis, which I'm just fascinated with. He's been studying social issues between men and women for over 50 years. So one of the things I'm excited to get into is his expertise in some of the things that I've known to be true, but he's bringing the research in. So I'm really excited to get into that. And he is also the only man to be elected 3 consecutive times to the National Organization for Women in New York City. So without further ado, I give you Dr. Warren Farrell.
Mark, glad to meet you.
It's my pleasure, Doctor. One of the things that you may have just heard me mention is that you've brought so much research and so many hours into the study of the importance of men in children's lives, specifically boys here in the boy crisis. So I'd like to open up our conversation by asking you, when did you realize that we had this issue with men, and what made you jump into this area of study?
Well, for some of my other books, I was speaking around the world in different places like Japan, and Japanese teacher would come up to me and say, this is like 20 years ago or so, in my class, boys are having more problems than girls. I wonder if this is true in just Japan. And then I go to other countries and I hear this over and over again. And so I started, that put it on my radar, that, this was not just girls that were having problems. And because I was on the board of directors of the National Organization for Women in New York City, I was more tuned into girls' problems. And so I started to note this, and ultimately I saw that in all 56 of the largest developed nations, that boys were falling behind girls in every single academic subject, but especially in reading and writing, which are the 2 biggest predictors of success or failure. And so that, increased my alertness. And I said, what do developed nations have in common? What the developed nations had in common is that there was more permission for divorce, and there was more permission for women to have children without being married. And it was in these 2 demographics that there was a significant percentage of boys that did not have much father involvement, that I eventually called dad-deprived boys. And it was in this group of dad-deprived boys that the problems were occurring. These boys were far more likely to be unmotivated, to not have good discipline, to not have good postponed gratification, to become obese, to not do their homework, to do poorly in school, to be disobedient, to drop out of school, to be bullies and be bullied, to have problems with drug overdose, addiction to not only drugs, but also to video game addiction and to porn addiction. And so these boys were likely ultimately to commit suicide more. And then I started looking more closely at just different populations like mass shooters, and found that more than 90% of the mass shooters were dad-deprived boys. Then I had run for governor of California and had spoken to different prison populations, and had learned from the prison administrators that more than 90% of the boys in prison were dad-deprived boys. And so I checked this out in other places of the country with judges and administrators. They all said the same thing. So then I looked at not just the mass shooters and the prisoners, but also the ISIS recruits, and found that most of those were dad-deprived boys, or this much smaller percentage of girls that were ISIS recruits were also dad-deprived girls. And so I saw, my goodness, if you just take the ISIS recruits and the prisoners, and you take the mass shooters, and you think about what we spend to prevent the mass shootings and for homeland security and the cyber warfare that we get involved with, we're talking about well over $1 trillion per year spent on the price of dad deprivation. And so I began to realize that the absence of dad creates the presence of government. The absence of dad creates the absence of the essence of the positive side of boyhood. And so I started to write about this and think about this, and realize that so many boys have both a purpose void and a dad void, a purpose void, because they no longer have their old senses of purpose of be a soldier or be a sole breadwinner. And that's actually in many ways a good thing. They had flexibility of purpose. But without a dad and mom working together to help them discover their new senses of purpose, there was oftentimes a rudderlessness and the testosterone of the boy could not be channeled constructively, so it began to be channeled destructively. And so those were some of the things that began to fascinate me. And then I started asking the big question, which is, what do dads do differently than what moms do, and why does that matter?
I think that's an incredibly important question to be asking, because we're living in a world where there's so much context, there's so many different ways of life, whether it's economic, social, religious, political. There's so many different types of situations out there, and I think it's incredibly important that we focus in on what is causing this lack of a positive role model, and how can we either get dads more involved, which to me is the most important thing that we're not talking about, is how can we get dads more involved and giving them. I live, just a little bit of context, I live here in Coral Springs, South Florida, very close to Parkland.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay. My
Yes.
kids, when they are of age, are going to be zoned to go to Majory Stoneman Douglas.
Mm-hmm.
So I know personally the hurt of a community that's been struck by that. And
Uh,
it's just so important. It's so important that we get dads involved. So the question I have for you is, when we look at all these different types of uh, situations, relationships, families, and households, what do dads do? What is the parenting technique that dads employ that really gives boys, specifically, that structure that they need when they become men?
yes. Um, about nine differences between dad style parenting and mom style parenting. I'd say probably the single most important one is boundary enforcement. I'll give you maybe two examples of that. So, dads and moms set boundaries pretty much the same way. They both say, sweetie, you can have your ice cream when you finish your peas. Kids test boundaries the same way. They try to have as few peas as possible before they get
Yes.
their ice cream. And the difference is in the reaction, the boundary enforcement. Moms will tend to think to themselves, okay, sweetie, I'll tell you what, you don't want to have all your peas. Well, have half of the peas. And if you do have half the peas, then maybe you can have your ice cream. So the kid says, I can manipulate a better deal here, and has a quarter of the peas. And mom goes, okay, I'm not going to get into a big fight over a few peas. All right, you tried. I feel like I did better than if I didn't tell you to have those peas. So, okay, you can have your ice cream now that you've had a quarter of your peas. Dad's response tends to be different. And of course, sometimes moms and dads are reversed in their orientation. But so dads will tend to say, "Excuse me, we have a deal here. The deal here is you know what the deal is. I know what the deal is, and you know I know what the deal is. And the deal is finish your peas." "Oh, Dad, you're so mean. Mom doesn't make me do that." And you're here with Dad now. Finish your peas or no ice cream. You don't have to finish your peas, but then there's no ice cream. "Oh, Dad, you're so mean." But well, you can continue complaining and crying, and then there'll be no ice cream tomorrow night either. "Oh, shoot.
Right.
I've got to finish these peas." So what the kid is learning with the mom is that there's a way to manipulate a better deal, particularly if the kid complains about maybe being bullied in school or having a bad day, or mom is feeling guilty about a divorce or something along those lines. The child with the mom is much more likely to learn to be more coercive and a greater manipulator,
Mm.
and also more likely to have, for a reason I'll explain in a minute, ADHD. And so with the dads, the child learns that it cannot have what it wants to have, the ice cream, until it does what it needs to do, finish the peas. And there's no deal that can be made.
Mm.
Therefore, the child's focus is not on manipulating, but rather on doing what it needs to do, which means postponed gratification is introduced to the boy child with the father to a much greater degree than with the mother as a rule. And so then that postponed gratification has a slippery slope effect, or the lack of postponed gratification has that. When the boy doesn't have postponed gratification, or by the way, the girl either, most of the problems that boys have, girls just have to a lesser degree. They have a female role model, and when if they're with a single mother family, and girls have more permission to cry and ask for help, so we discover what their problems are sooner. But without a male role model, boys don't have those things. So the boys, they go to school and they try to finish homework, but they get distracted more easily if they don't have postponed gratification by an incoming text or an offer to do something fun. And so then they feel ashamed of themselves for not finishing their homework as often. They get worse grades. Ultimately, they get less praise from teachers. They're not respected as much by their female and male peers. They don't hear as much praise from mom and dad. So they begin to feel ashamed of themselves, disappointed. They start turning to video games where they can win at some game that they perfect and have friends that are sort of just know them only in their video game capacity. Or then becomes boy girl time. And the boys learn that, the girls are not interested in dating boys that can't make the football team, that can't, act in a play, that can't finish their homework, that can't get good grades, that can't be student body president. Girls want to date winners. They want to get to date performers. They don't want to date losers. And he feels like he's a loser. And so it's boy girl time. And he starts realizing that he doesn't want to be rejected constantly by girls. And especially in the hashtag Me Too era where, his rejection is going to be magnified by if he moves too quickly, he's going to be considered a sexual harasser. If he doesn't move quickly enough, he's going to be considered a wimp. And so he's sort of like caught between this rock and a hard place. So what does he do? He gets involved with porn. I define porn as access to a variety of attractive women without fear of rejection at a price he can afford. And so, but the problem with porn, I mean, there's a number of problems, crossing out the moral problems for a moment. The problem with porn is that it addicts, that it stimulates dopamine only when you're no longer bored by the last sexual act that stimulated you. So you have to increase the risk in order to continue stimulating the dopamine. So as he increases what the expectation of sexual involvement is, he finally meets, let's say, a girl or a woman that is really maybe open to being sexual with him. And so he starts treating that woman like she's somebody in the porn films. And now the woman feels like a sex object rather than as a full human being, and so which she is. And so she withdraws, and then soon he feels like a loser and returns to the porn where he's not going to be rejected, and the cycle continues. And so in worst case scenarios, particularly single mother boys, because they tend to be more protected, are also more sensitive. And so all these rejections he doesn't have a method of just discounting the rejections. He really experiences and takes these rejections in, which creates sadness and withdrawal, but also creates anger and hurt. And so he begins to, sometimes in the worst case scenarios, hurt himself, like he'll maybe commit suicide or be very depressed. Or in the super worst case scenarios, he'll become a mass shooter, because as a mass shooter, he's saying, no one pays attention to me. No one cares about me. If I do this mass shooting, somebody will say, I should have paid attention to Jim. Or in the case of Parkland, I should have paid attention to Nicholas Cruz, who was in fact a dad-deprived boy. And so this is sort of the slippery slope that the lack of dad involvement tends to create.
So you have this kind of like chain reaction that starts off as something very, very small and then just over the years gets worse and worse and worse. And it sounds like that chain reaction, based on your research, is caused by the lack of boundaries in the child's life, right? So one of the things that I'm blessed with is having a wife, and we both have the same goals, right? We have the same goals. We might have different ways of getting there, but we communicate with that, right? And so to me, it seems like by having a structure where you have two partners together that maybe have different parenting styles, like you can combine forces with the same goal to try to give the child the ability to negotiate, which is, I think, an important skill to have, but also say, hey, you don't have the leverage here. this is the rule you need to abide by. You need to set those boundaries.
You're absolutely right. Dads do something else that's huge, and that is they tend to create bonds by playing with the children. Like they'll be coaching with the children. I see dads in supermarkets, taking boxes of cereal, and the carton that the child's rolling around becomes the basket, and he's having the kid toss the box of cereal into the basket, or he's looking over all the statistics on the carton to teach the child math in terms of how much calories does this have, how much sugar, how much fat, and making a game out of it. But he'll also do things that moms consider pretty crazy, like roughhousing.
Yes.
And so, it's typical that dad will be much more likely to say, throw his three kids onto a couch. And the game is the three of you jump off the couch and onto my back. And your job is to pin me down before I pin you down. And so the kids get all excited and they jump onto his back and they push the other one aside. And and the mom is looking at this and thinking, oh my God, I feel like I just have one more child to monitor here. On the other hand, the mom is going, the kids seem to be having a lot of fun. I don't want to be the spoiled sport, but I'm just fearing that sooner or later, this is going to end up as somebody crying or somebody getting hurt. Well, mom's only about 99.9% likely to be right.
Right.
And so sooner or later, somebody does get hurt or starts crying, and mom goes, shoo. I feel, on the one hand, I feel guilty that I didn't intervene. I didn't want the children to cry. I knew this was going to happen. And on the other hand, now at least dad will stop and not do any more roughhousing. But dad goes, sweetie, what you should have done is not, you can't put your elbow, let's say, into your younger sister's eyes, in order to win at this roughhousing. Oh, okay, Dad, okay. So I'm going to give you another chance. So I'm going to go back to the roughhousing. So then they go back to the roughhousing, but what the children usually experience is what psychologists call emotional intelligence under fire, or they are tested for emotional intelligence under fire. But the children, having agreed to not be rough in this inappropriate way, being aggressive versus assertive, they get really excited and they forget about their promise and they go back to the old way again. And so then dad, usually if he's a good dad, says, okay, no more roughhousing. Oh, dad, we're sorry. I'm sorry, no more roughhousing. We'll pick it up again tomorrow night. See if you've learned your lesson by then. But for now, no more roughhousing. But he's created a bond with the child, so the children know that tomorrow night's going to be fun again, like a roller coaster. Dad's going to give us excitement, but he's also going to protect us like a roller coaster. So the next night comes, and mom's going, like, you must be kidding! Didn't you learn your lesson last night? You gave them a warning, and they couldn't get it. Kids can't get it at that age. So the following night, the roughhousing does it again. And once again they go back to somebody hurts somebody else, and then dad stops the roughhousing, but at that point the kids learn, oh yes, if I do, sooner or later, usually at that point or the following time, the kids learn, I see that when I do this pushing of my sister or brother, I lose what I want. So the children learn that empathy gets them what they want more of. Children aren't naturally empathetic, they're naturally self-centered. But when they lose what they want, the roughhousing, then they begin to have the discipline to become empathetic to their sisters or brothers' needs, because they know they're going to lose the fun, the excitement that they want. And so therefore they start training themselves to think of their sisters and brothers' needs. Whereas mom is looking on and going, after a while, I'm so, this is really weird, because I have to keep repeating the same thing over and over again, and the kids don't listen to me. Why is it that dad just says it once and the kids listen to them? And the answer is because the kids know that they will pay a price if they don't listen, and that price is something they want. If mother just repeats, you shouldn't be too rough on your brother or sister, being rough, winning at the roughhousing is far more of a seduction than mom just repeating the same instruction over again. And so these are the types of things that create the boundary enforcement, that create the postponed gratification, that lead to children feeling much prouder about their ability to accomplish, more praised by adults, by teachers, more likely to be successful and therefore be attractive to women, and lead to less of that slippery slope that can, in the Nicholas Cruz and Parkland case, lead to the mass shootings.
I'll be honest, I'm going to have to check my house for video cameras because this whole situation of the kids jumping off the couch and being thrown around and mom is freaking out in the corner, I'm pretty sure you've been watching and filming me because that sounds like every night at my house. But what I think
I've
is
been wanting to request. I have only a low resolution calendar in your house. A camera? Can you get me a higher resolution camera?
we'll have to look into that one. I mean, it's just it's so amazing to me that these points, these things that we don't even think about doing, we're actually doing on a regular basis. And one of the things that I really try to hit home with the Act a Dad community is patience, right? Because kids are so good at pushing buttons. You're like, man, I'm just tired of him crying or whining. I'm just going to give it to him so I can have some peace and quiet.
Yes,
But
yes.
but like you're saying here, it's your boys in particular, but both kids, they need those boundaries.
Yes.
They need you to be patient. They need those boundaries in order to know when to stop and know that your actions have consequences.
Yes, and here's a really important challenge for, I'm married now to a woman who I met 25 years ago, and so we're 25 years together. But one of the things, but in between my first marriage and my marriage to Liz, my wife, we had I dated almost exclusively women who had children, and almost all of these women were extremely hard workers. Were
Sure.
dedicated to their children. Many of them were trying to put enough money together to work outside the home as well as inside the home. And the number one word that they use most frequently, almost, I don't think there was an exception to the rule, is the word overwhelmed.
Right.
So here we have single moms who are almost invariably overwhelmed. We have enormous numbers of dads all over the world who are feeling undervalued. So we have overwhelmed and undervalued dads, underappreciated dads. And we have children who are experiencing a boy crisis among the boys and are experiencing considerable problems among girls as well. Girls manifest some different problems. Girls that don't have a lot of father wrestling and that type of thing are far more likely to become pregnant out of wedlock when they're teenagers. The girls are uncomfortable with boys and men and being a combination of physical and knowing not how to be sexual with the person that they're physical with. And so the lack of comfort with males leads to many young girls, when they first get involved with a male, feeling that they don't want to lose that boy to another girl. So they know the one thing that can keep him is being sexual with him. And
Right.
so they're sexual before they're comfortable being sexual because they don't know how to speak, dialogue, and create value with a boy in other ways. And so and then we have a second issue, which is that this is not moms to blame here. Moms can't hear what dads don't say.
Right.
And I don't know a single dad that explains to moms, by the way, when I do that roughhousing, the data shows that children who experience roughhousing with dads are far more likely to be empathetic. Who'd have
Right.
known? Roughhousing, empathy, their data, that's counterintuitive. But I hope that my explanation before makes sense as to why that happens, that it's not just the roughhousing per se, it's the roughhousing combined with the boundary enforcement, combined with the bond that dad creates that makes the children not resent the boundary enforcement because they're going to go back and get more excitement. That's what leads to the empathy, the requirement to think of somebody else in order to get what you want to get. The children also learn when they're roughhousing, and I don't hear dads say, sweetie, I want you to know that when I roughhouse with the children, they're more likely to be assertive, not aggressive, because roughhousing looks like you often have more opportunity to be aggressive. And isn't that what led to the children crying? So doesn't that mean they're learning aggressiveness? And the answer is no. They're learning the distinction between being assertive versus aggressive. And they learn that distinction by making the mistake of being aggressive too often and learning to pay a price for that mistake until they learn the fine distinctions between where are the boundary lines, the gray lines, and the circumstances in which assertiveness is not aggressiveness, and when does it go over the line. Those are very subtle things that cannot be explained by lectures or intellectual explanations. They have to be explained by being experienced. And so moms aren't to blame because dads don't do this. Dads aren't to blame because you can't read this in a parenting magazine. And so one of the reasons that I started to articulate this in the Boy Crisis book was because it wasn't being articulated anyplace else. And as a result of that, moms and dads each thought the other one was deficient. And there were sort of arguments. The arguments often led to divorces. The divorces led to the children not having their fathers, led to the boy crisis. And so I was, sort of said, let me back up here. And, solution number one was to articulate this in the boy crisis. Solution number two was to teach people couples communication skills, which I do
Right.
all around the country in couples communication workshops, because I found that the single biggest deficiency that led to divorces was fathers and mothers not knowing how to handle each other's personal criticism. The Achilles heel of all human beings is our inability to handle personal criticism from a loved one without becoming defensive. Therefore, it makes the other one feel unsafe sharing what their hurts and pains and feelings and fears are. And the more they feel unsafe doing it, the less they do it, the more they feel unheard, the more they feel attracted to somebody that will hear them, that doesn't have so much at stake, and the more the relationship falls apart. Now, many people don't get divorces, but they live in minimum security prison marriages. And that's, for me, deeply sad. And so my couples communication work was to make the effort to prevent that from happening.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. The core of every strong relationship is communication, whether that's with your partner, with your boss, with colleagues, with your children. Communication is the key. And fathers in general don't tend to communicate their feelings very well. And A, and B, when it comes to parenting styles, I know that in general, people aren't talking about fatherhood very often, right? It's just not a common thing that people talk about. You go online, how to be a better parent, and it's page after page after page of how to be a better mother, not how to be a better father. Okay. And you start looking at what's happening in society, opioids and suicides and mass shootings. I feel like as a society, we're looking at all these ways to band-aid the problems, but not at how do we get down to the core? How do we fix it? And to me, I think it's having conversations like this and not only just telling the fathers, but also telling mothers that, hey, that roughhousing, those boundaries that your husband or ex-husband is setting are vital to your child's development. So I guess my question here is, how do we get this word out in addition to the Boy Crisis, the book that you've written, your YouTube channel, your many interviews on nationally syndicated television? What are some ways that we can get this message out to parents and to society that, look, the father is really freaking important?
First, we have to sort of work on the communication between men and women. Dads have to know how they are valuable. And so, and in order for them to know that, this message has to be heard more than by the type of people who would buy the Boy Crisis book to read or to listen to, because they will still, if it's selling in small numbers, they're going to feel still isolated and a little bit alone and a little bit weird for being a full-time dad and going into a park and being the only male with his children there, and having women being talking to each other instead of looking at him like, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you working? Type of thing. We have to realize as a society that we're facing a major problem here. We've spent the last 50 years helping women become integrated into the workplace. When I was on the board of the National Organization for Women in New York City, both Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan knew and said that the women's movement would eventually plateau if it did not become inclusive of men becoming equally involved in the home with fathers, not just doing the housework, but being involved as fathers with their children. If men did not do that, the women's movement would eventually plateau. And so they had that understanding, and one of the reasons I was such an active feminist was because I felt that this was going to be not a women's movement blaming men or a men's movement blaming women, but it was going to be a gender liberation movement with both sexes freeing themselves from the rigid roles of the past, and exercising more flexible roles for the future. That is, it would be a gender liberation movement, not just a feminist movement, and certainly not a toxic feminist movement in which so many feminists are talking about male privilege, and we live in a world dominated by a patriarchy, which was men making rules to benefit men at the expense of women. People who made the rules to benefit men at the expense of women would not have made rules for them to be willing to die in each generation's war. Programming yourself to be disposable is not male privilege. It's male sacrifice so that other people can survive, like women and children can survive, and other males can survive. And so the understanding of men as making rules to benefit themselves, if men made rules to benefit themselves, they'd be making rules for women to want sex more and for men to want sex less, so that men would have leverage to hold their section short supply while women came after them, paid for them, paid for dinners, paid for drinks, paid for diamonds, that type of thing. That would be a patriarchal society in which men made the rules to benefit men at the expense of women, and we don't actually have that at this point, as you know. So the point of my mentioning all these things about the toxic part of feminism is that it's hurting so many boys. So many of our boys are going into school and they're told, if you do succeed, it's because you have male privilege. If you fail, it's because you're a loser. If you reach out too quickly to a woman, you're a sexual harasser. If you don't reach out quickly enough to a woman, you're a wimp. And so the boys, who are on average less mature than the females that they're interested in, are just confused. They're afraid to move. They withdraw into porn. They do these types of things. And so there's a huge amount of toxicity that is being imposed upon our sons today in school. And that's exactly where they should be learning to be able to express their feelings, not to be told this is women's time to speak up and men's time to shut up. If you express your feelings, if you're toxic because you don't express your feelings, but if you do express your feelings, you're mansplaining.
I mean, it's definitely a paradox and I feel like the best way to build yourself up is to build up the people around you. And communication is just so important to this whole thing, right? Getting men and women in various communities together to say, hey, by building each other up, everybody wins. It seems to me that we live in a very divisive time in the world, although the world is always divisive, but we're living in a very divisive time where if you tweet the wrong thing, you can just get completely killed on social media, right? And things are so divisive. It seems like people are afraid to actually have real conversations because they're afraid of being kicked out of the cool kids table, right? And look, I don't want to get super political because, and frankly, nothing divides people up like politics. But
Yes.
I think as a rule, I think the majority of people want the same things. They want a better world with more opportunities, with more wealth, with more health, with better families. They want all these things. They just have different ways of getting there. So one of the things I think is really cool about what you're doing, Doctor, right now is you're talking to a lot of the people that are going to be running for political positions, right? And so the question I have for you is, what are the chances, what are the ways that we can spread this message of how important fathers are in a child's life? And not to say, hey, we want to take away from the woman's right. That's not what it's about. We're looking at what's best for our children,
Yes.
because they're our future leaders, our future warriors, they're our future parents in themselves. So how do we open up this conversation amongst the people out in the world?
Yes, I have been trying to speak both with the Democratic presidential candidates to bring this up. This last weekend in Iowa, I spoke with 11 of the presidential candidates to try to explain to them, what the boy crisis was. Eric Swalwell was talking about how, we have gun violence and he wants to cut back gun violence. That's terrific. But in order to end gun violence, you have to have two things. One is get the guns out, and two is get the dads in. And so that's really important. The second is we have to really begin to introduce demand that our school systems have four things. One is that they start having communication skills training for our sons and our daughters
Mm,
in first, second, and third grade, like they're doing in Denmark. That's what reduces bullying. That's what helps people hear points of view that aren't their point of view, and without putting other people down. The bully and the bullied are very similar personalities, by the way. And so they both feel insecure. They both have low self-esteem. And so they both benefit by communication. However, if we're doing communication skills training in first, second, and third grade, we have to also have it for those children's parents, because if they don't have it for the parents, then the children with better communication skills go home and lose respect for their parents who are being defensive with every argument when they've learned how to not be defensive. And then that will destabilize the family in that hierarchical type of way of the children not having respect for their parents. So communication skills training has to happen for both children and for parents. Number two, the schools need to have about an equal number of male and female teachers. And when I say male teachers, I don't just mean males who are imitation female. I'm sort of an imitation female. I'm sort of, academic. I'm sensitive. I'm into communication. I'm into relationships. I used to design my own shirts, that type of thing. And so, but you don't want the classroom just filled with men like me. You want them filled with more traditional men, more conservative men, as well as men like me. So your son, no matter where on the spectrum he is, has somebody he can identify with and empathize with, so that boys don't go from female-only homes to female-only school systems. And then we all look askance and say, gee, I wonder why he was attracted to a gang leader who
right,
had an
right,
authoritarian personality and said that he'd give him respect. I wonder why he's
right.
attracted to a drug dealer who has an authoritarian personality and says he can make money and be a hero to the girls because he'll have money when the other boys don't have money. And so the boys are vulnerable to leaders who give them direction and structure, and they will do it destructively if they don't get it from their dad constructively. But we also have to be help. So we have to do two things here. One is to get the father. We have to send out a whole message through our political leaders, our school leaders, our church leaders, that in the old days we had males being warriors who had to
Right.
kill and be killed on the killing fields. Today, we have the opportunity to train boys to be father warriors. We have to realize that when we give boys encouragement to be a hero, but they will be willing to die to be a hero, to be praised, to be loved, to be respected, which is why in every single war we gave boys social bribes to be disposable. Masculinity was dependent upon training your son to be disposable in war or disposable in the hazardous jobs in the workplace. And and then you learned you were a man. Well, today we need fewer boys in war and fewer boys as sole breadwinners because women are to a greater degree sharing that burden. And so so this frees boys up to be able to be father warriors, where we say a boy who overcomes the social barriers and discrimination to be an equally involved dad, he is somebody we praise, we acknowledge, we see as contributing to society in a way that we never had the privilege to have happen before when we had to train our sons to be disposable in war. This is an opportunity of a lifetime, and we have to do a shift. The shift, ironically, to give the feminists some credit, was acknowledged by Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan in the second stage said, as I mentioned before, that the feminist movement will plateau if there's not an equal amount of father involvement in the home as there is an equal amount of female involvement in the workplace. Both of them knew that and articulated that. And now, ironically, we have to go back to that rediscovery. But I want to spend a minute talking with single moms for a moment.
Sure.
If you're a single mom, what can you do? And here are a few things. One is get your children involved in Cub Scouts or Boy Scouts. Enormous evidence that getting your son involved in Cub Scouts increases your son's character and ability to trust, be trusted, be loyal, have integrity, things that we all want our sons and daughters to be. Second, you need to get your sons involved in both Cub Scouts and Mankind projects, other initiation rites for boys. But initiation rites weekends will not solve a problem of boy neglect the rest of his life. Boys need mentors. We know this. But they also need, and this is much more powerful than being mentored, boys who do even better than ones who are mentored are ones who mentor. That is when a boy, when you find a boy who's not doing as well as your son, even if your son is doing poorly, find a boy who's doing even less well. Find a boy who's younger and work with your son to mentor that boy. Because once a boy is a mentor, he starts looking at all his behaviors. If I get bad grades, how will that look to the boy that I'm mentoring? I want him to be proud of me because I can't be an effective mentor unless I do well. And so he starts doing better in order to be able to be a better mentor to the boy that he's mentoring. So that's another example. Get your son involved in a faith-based community, no matter what your background, whether you have a priest, minister, rabbi, or imam. And don't just get him involved in a faith-based community, but ask your faith-based leader to get other groups of boys who are your son's age to be able to have those boys talk with each other so that they don't go around saying, I have no problems. I'm, a big, strong man, because men's weakness is their facade of strength. And so when the facade of strength is a mask that boys wear, and when boys hear that other boys also have on their mask, and they're encouraged by a faith-based leader to take off that mask, they don't feel so alone, so isolated, so ashamed, so in need of video game addiction to get video game friends. They have lower dopamine ways of being able to get approval and respect from other boys their ways and their age, and they're able to express their feelings, without which they do become toxic.
So I think to look at all to kind of summarize and bring all these various points together, because quite frankly, there's so many, and you definitely need to go out and either read The Boy Crisis or listen to it on audio, because it's just there's a lot more. We just don't have enough time to unravel everything. But it seems like the biggest things are communication, setting boundaries, communicating with each other and setting boundaries for our children. And just kind of bring back to your point, I think that the things that have taught me the most is when I'm actually teaching. Like it's kind of funny how when you're teaching your children things and they're learning, you end up learning probably just as much about yourself, if not more, than they actually are learning.
You are so right. My wife, Liz, comes to all my couples communication workshops, and we find that, while the feedback from the couples is phenomenal and makes us very happy and gratified, we find that we're taking things off the back burner that I'm remembering to tell other people that, oh yeah, we haven't done as much of that as we should be doing. And it really helps us. When you're a teacher, you put the pieces together, and you proactively remind yourself of the things that you're teaching, and that's for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Dr. Farrell, it's been a pleasure. I just wanted to circle back and kind of tie up one loose end. You said that as far as what we need to do in schools, you gave us 2 out of these 4 examples. I know that another one of the examples is recess. We got to bring back recess so we can get physical. We can get physical out there. We get our bodies moving. It's just kind of a way to unwind. Children statistically in your research do a lot better after academically when they have recess.
Absolutely right. The CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, just came out with a study that I talked about in the Boy Crisis, saying that for each minute, beyond a certain point, for each minute that you spend doing recess or physical activity, your test scores are better than the equivalent number of minutes studying for the test. While this
Wow.
is true for both boys and girls, it's especially true for boys. But this was true, the CDC found, for both girls and boys. The second thing, so recess, we've tended to minimize in school, partially because we say, well, we need more time for subject matter, but also because so many schools are afraid of any legal suits against them if something happens to a boy or girl at recess. That's a huge mistake. Number two, the number four actually, is vocational education.
Ah,
In the old days, boys who weren't academic, I was academic in school, but about a third of the students in school that were boys were not academic, and Japan recognizes this. So they have a huge, about one third of the students are in vocational education tracks. And among the students in vocational education tracks, 99.6% get a job immediately after they graduate. And
wow.
whereas in the United States, boys who don't do well academically often fail out of school. And among the boys that fail out of school, more than 20% in high school do not have jobs in their 20s. That's 5 times the national unemployment average. And these boys that don't have jobs, they're the ones whose testosterone gets channeled destructively, that become angry, and then are likely to do the school shootings, the mass shootings, even the shootings at work if they're fired because they don't have a skill set to fall back on and they don't have confidence to fall back on. So the vocational education needs to come into our school system in a major way. Male teachers, communication, and recess. Those are just four of the things that would be helpful for all of our schools to begin to develop.
I love it. I love that it's so actionable. It's so simple. Um, there's challenges, of course, but it's so simple. These are some very actionable things that we can do. Well, Dr. Farrell, I just appreciate you so much for your work and in focusing on, I think, probably the most important thing that we are not talking about, which is our failure to bring up boys and our failure to empower father figures in our boys' lives. So I just want to thank you so much. The Boy Crisis, definitely a book you want to check out, either physical copy or on audio. If you're like me and you're driving in the car all the time, audio can be very, very helpful to listen to. So definitely check that out.
Thank you. It's been just a pleasure talking with you. You really ask good questions and you listen so well, Mark. I can see why you must be a great dad and a great husband.
Hey, that above all, that means a lot to me, Dr. Farrell. I really appreciate your time, and I'm absolutely looking forward to watching your story unfold over the coming months and years because it's been really interesting to watch you, especially on YouTube. Your YouTube videos are very, very informative. So that's definitely a good place to check out Dr. Farrell as well.
Thank you. Wonderful talking with you.
My pleasure. Have a great day.
Thank you.